Hi, this is Gila. So today I want to talk about something a little different. I want to talk about climate change and global warming. Now, I've been seeing various posts on Twitter and on YouTube suggesting that global warming is a hoax. And it's some terrible left-wing conspiracy designed to shock us. And just recently, in the last few days, there's been a 16-year-old girl speaking at the UN about climate change, and it's caused all sorts of reactions. Well, just as when I wanted to find out about Islam, I spent some time researching it. Actually, over the past few years, I have spent some time researching climate change. I'm not a scientist. My PhD is actually in music composition, but I've always been fascinated by planets and space and geology and history and paleontology, all sorts of things from the past. And basically, there is a lot of scientific evidence for global warming. Now, let me explain a little from what I have learned, and I'm going to give some links to some particularly interesting talks I've come across on YouTube. Some of them actually a few years old, but very, very well worth listening to. Basically, we find out about past weather in the past million years or so through ice cores in places like Greenland. The ice is sort of packed on top, and they can drill right down and take ice from a long way down, and they can actually release the air bubbles, and they can tell what the atmosphere was like at that time. And going back a lot more in terms of millions of years, they can also drill cores at the bottom of the oceans. There's the Atlantic Ridge, which is kind of spewing out new land at the bottom of the sea, which is pushing Europe and America further and further apart, just a little bit each year, but over millions of years, obviously, it's had a huge effect. And so there's plenty of scientific evidence for weather, or rather climate, which is much more long-term in the past. And actually, what scientists have discovered that we are in an unusually cold period of time. This may surprise us, but if you go back, say, to the Cretaceous many millions of years ago when we had dinosaurs, the weather overall was warmer, but it was not proportionately the same around the globe. The areas that were particularly different were the Arctic and the Antarctic. They were a lot warmer, and there was no snow and ice that collected there, no ice caps. But over millions of years, in more recent geological time, they have grown. And what are the reasons? Well, part of it is because India is pushing into Asia and has produced the Himalayas and the huge Tibetan uplands, unusually high. Maybe not for us, we're used to them, but unusually high in geological time. And that actually has an effect. It takes out carbon from the atmosphere. I don't pretend to understand all the science, but that is the scientific reality. Another thing that has happened very recently in geological time past, about 3 or 4 million years, I'm not sure exactly, is that basically North America and South America have joined up with Mexico and that wiggly bit in the middle. And that has strongly affected the way the oceans work and currents and the whole climate. So in recent geological time, say the last million years, we've had a series of ice ages. Now, the reason for that is there are differences in the orbit of the Earth. It's not the same, okay? There is a part where it's a little further from the sun, which is actually at the moment in our winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and where it's a little it's a little closer in our winter, a little further away in our summer in the Northern Hemisphere, and obviously the opposite for the Southern Hemisphere. And over time, these things change. And there was a very smart guy who worked all this out with a lot of help. And basically, the cycles have a profound effect on our weather, or have done, or sorry, on our climate, not on our immediate weather, in more recent times. And the ice ages and how hot or cold it is line up very well with these cycles that have been worked out about how the sun and the earth and everything works. And we are actually in a warm period, in an interglacial. But actually what we should have been having in the past few thousand years is we should have been getting cooler according to everything else. And we haven't, except for a shorter period during the Middle Ages. And the reason for that is us. Because about 8,000 years ago or so, people started burning large areas of forests as farming took over. And that put carbon into the atmosphere and actually kept it a little warmer than it would otherwise have been. The difference in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, it was before then about 230 parts per million, and it rose to about 280 parts per million. This was all before the Industrial Revolution. And the weather started getting colder again. There are stories of ice fairs in the 17th century on the River Thames when it froze over. And the weather was definitely a bit colder then. However, we've had the Industrial Revolution and we are pumping out vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. There's actually a worse one, methane. It's far worse, but it lasts far less time than carbon dioxide. But the overall effect is to keep the heat in. Now, back in the Cretaceous, actually, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was much higher than it is today. But so was sea level. There is a correlation between sea level and overall temperature, especially at the Arctic and Antarctic, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we haven't caught up yet. Now, maybe in the past it didn't really matter if sea level gradually rose or went down or whatever. But nowadays it does, because most of our main cities are close to the sea. So if sea level rises by any significant amount, it's going to have a devastating effect on our whole centres of population. Now, my generation, I'm middle-aged now, is probably not going to see too much change, although we are already seeing some. Part of it's all to do with the jet stream and so on, and the fact that it's getting hotter faster at the Arctic, and as snow and ice cover diminishes, then there is less reflection back into space, and so it's a kind of cumulative effect. Once you start losing ice, you start losing more and more, because we lose what's called the albedo effect of reflecting back light and heat. And basically the jet stream is becoming more sluggish, and so that gives us prolonged systems of weather. They can be cold spells if they're north of the jet stream, or they can be hot spells. They're longer. And also bigger, faster cyclones, tropical storms, hurricanes, and so on. And we are seeing some of that, if you have been following the weather in recent years. Anyway, please feel free to look at some of the documentaries. I'm a bit of a documentary buff myself. There's one in particular which puts this all into context in terms of geological time. And global warming is not a left-wing hoax. It is real. There is plenty of scientific evidence for it. And what we do about it, well, we don't all have to go out and be socialists, but I would suggest that we take the threat seriously. And the most important effects are firstly higher temperatures, which are going to affect the growing of crops, but also rising sea level, which is predicted to rise a lot more by the end of the century than it will in the first part of the 21st century. Go and find out for yourself and make your own informed decisions. But seriously, I think we need to think seriously about it. for our future generations, and maybe try and get into more renewable types of energy. Think seriously what we're going to bequeath to our descendants. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. Have a great week. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.